Are we measuring how long each of us have done this for? It's not about how long you do it, Roland. It's about what you do in the time you have.
Yeah, I'm doing the same thing for 40 years now. Damn it, I have 40 years of experience.
40 times 1 year.
I'm not going to dignify that with a response.
Ooh, the elder statesman takes a step back. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
We're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Roland Volt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlandson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Roland. And I got to tell you, I am really excited to have our guest back on the show. My goodness, a repeat guest today. It's really cheered me up. I was feeling a little tired this morning, and seeing all y'all faces has brightened my day. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well. And I'm also happy to have, I think, our first recurring guest. Don't want to call him ambassador now. He needs to come back a third time before we do this. But welcome, Caspar. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, guys. I'm very happy to be back on the show.
Well, the good news is we don't have to introduce you, because everyone can go back to, I think, episode 16, 17, I think 16.
Around that area.
Yeah. Can go back. And then we spoke about 2.5 hours about your background. So they just can listen to that.
Yeah, of course. Good
I'm glad. And having you back on the show, Caspar, it's really interesting. I love to see the evolution of people's thought across the different topics of BPM. I mean, here's the thing. When you came on originally, you had a particular perspective. And first and foremost, I'd love to check in and see. So tell me a little bit about what's been going on for the past, I guess it's been 2 years. And what have you learned? How have your perspective changed about the marketplace and about some of the key challenges that you've seen people face? I know you've been focused a lot in the last couple of years on operational resilience.
Yeah, true. So the first appearance I had on your podcast was around management of change.
Yeah.
So we talked about, it's all nice and fluffy to have documented everything that you do in processes and all that kind of stuff. But if you don't have any procedures in place to keep it up to date and to have a controlled management of change, then in no time it becomes outdated again. I mean, that notion, I think, is still as strong as it was then, because unfortunately what I encounter in working with clients is that they still, not all of them at least, have understood that point. They're very often focused on getting the project done, getting the processes documented, getting everything that they want to do with the BPM project. But they don't always think about, okay, so now we're live, now what? So that part really hasn't changed much. What has changed, I think, is that there is more awareness in the marketplace about the fact that things are connected to each other. It's not just, I have an application landscape, and I have a process landscape, and I have a risk and control landscape. And now they start to understand that, wait a minute, these things are actually connected.
Yeah, I had a call yesterday, what a coincidence, with a listener of ours who reached out to me from Sweden. And they were thinking about moving away from one tool into another. And he was asking for some third-party advice, if you will. And we had a little chat about what that all takes and all those things. And their takeaway was, we got this tool for 10 years now, and we put all that stuff in, but it's still seen as an expert tool. So what do I do with this? What's the acceptance? And they want to have a fresh start in a different tool and basically just, not redo it, but obviously keep what they have and improve on it.
And I think I agree with that, Roland. And I think a second thing that I noticed in the last 2 years is, and it's correlated, I think, is the awareness within companies that it's much more about disclosing the information to a larger group of end users instead of just opening it up and making it possible for the expert users. I mean, the expert users are important, but it's a fairly small group in an organization. It's your center of excellence. It's maybe 10, 15, 20 people max. But the information that they put in is supposed to be consumed by the masses.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even then the question is, and that was one of the observations that they had, was well, there's still a steep learning curve going into the existing tool, even for the casual user.
Depends on the tool, but typically.
Yeah. And I feel like there's been a bit of a catalyst in the market. AI has put on such an expectation of sort of tailored presentations to individual needs. I mean, before we could always do this. That's the thing I think about AI as a catalyst for change in the way we approach things. It's revealing to everyone you could always have, with the right amount of effort, appealed to a larger number of stakeholders, but it's always been viewed as too much work for not as much value. But the promise of AI is you can do this with almost no work at all. It automatically happens, which means suddenly everything's accessible. So now the expectation is that everything is accessible. So people have to change how they approach because now there's I suppose I'll reveal a little bit more nerdy things about myself to our audiences online, but I play Dungeons and Dragons. It's a fun role-playing game online, and for those of you who follow that sort of thread of nerddom, there is a very famous dungeon master named Matthew Mercer who runs a show called Critical Role. I promise this is going to come around. And Matthew Mercer is incredibly talented. He's one of the most talented storytellers and writers and actors and voice actors that there is. And there's something called the Mercer effect, or people describe as the Mercer effect, is everyone now expects that their home games of Dungeons and Dragons will be of a higher quality, simply because one influencer managed to go around the world with his quality of performance. In that same way, I think that everyone, the Mercer effect, the AI effect is a similar thing. Now everyone expects this AI-powered, tailored views. This is, even if it wasn't, it wasn't planned by the team, the expectations are so much higher that people have to change the way they approach BPM in a lot of cases just because of it.
It's an interesting observation, JM, and I think that one of the main challenges that AI still has, I think. Just think about ChatGPT. I mean, we all know it can do wonderful things, but we also know it sometimes just makes stuff up. Depends on how it's trained. Now, if you extrapolate that into a BPM platform and you say, well, I have AI in here, so you just can ask it the normal questions in natural language, you can't have the situation that it just simply makes something up instead of just giving you exactly what's documented in your repository. Now, imagine if you are an FDA relevant company and you just ask the system a question and it just gives you a random answer.
Yeah.
You might be in deep.
Not good. Yeah.
If that. So, I mean, I think it's wonderful technology and I think it will become more and more important. But I'm not sure if it's far enough yet to just release it into the wild, so to speak.
Well, the question is, if everyone is using AI and AI is occasionally providing garbage results back to people, that in some ways that evens but lowers the playing field. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, like there's an expectation that some of the results you're going to get are garbage. In some ways, that puts an onus on the business users to be able to recognize AI as garbage, which is that's an interesting challenge. But also, I still have yet to have anyone answer me the question, who is liable if AI provides a bad answer and then automatically does an action?
It's
I think in Canada, I think that question has been answered, JM, because I think that there was a case. I think it was Canada. There was a case of a lady who asked the chatbot of an airline questions, and based on the answers, she took decisions that cost her a lot of money, and then she took it to court, and the airline tried to hide behind the chatbot. It's just AI. It's not us. And the court said, AI is an employee of yours, so you're liable, period. So that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I read that article too. Yeah, and that's the only way going forward, because otherwise nobody's responsible.
Otherwise it's going to be chaos.
But we're not talking about AI in this conversation, do we?
No, not that much. No.
Yeah, the topic of the day is obviously you developed over the last couple of years an adoption framework, and JM and I looked at it and we found it interesting, and we thought, hey, our ambassadors in waiting, they need a second chance. So we thought, okay, hey, JM, let's bring Caspar back and let's talk about the adoption framework.
Cool. Love to talk about that.
So maybe get started. Caspar.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the origins of your adoption framework. You know, why did you create this? You know, what was the need? What was the pain, and all those things?
So for the listeners that don't know me that well or haven't listened to the first episode, so I spent the last 6 years, so between 2018 and 2024, working for Software AG, the company behind Aris. And what I did a lot is I advised and coached clients on how to get the best out of BPM. And one of the mechanisms that we used is something called a solution review, where you basically say, let's interview a bunch of people in the organization and trying to figure out what is, well, very, very fitting, I would say, what is your baseline on your BPM maturity? And every time that we did that, I started to understand that I was asking the same type of questions. They might be tailored for different types of customers, but in the end, I found myself coming back to the same components and the same concepts over and over again. So I started to bring them together, and we combined that with originally the 3 key success factors that we knew existed around BPM projects. And we started working out and elaborate a little bit more on that until about, I would say, 6 months ago now. I simply looked at a blank PowerPoint slide, and I just started bringing parts together. And I mean, I love pizza, so a sort of a pizza-esque picture came to mind quite quickly. But it helped that we had 4 main categories in the adoption framework. But what it basically does is saying, listen, these are things that you can start a BPM project anywhere in any scale. But if you want to ever think about scaling it up to an organizational level, say enterprise BPM, then these are the things that you need to think about. These are the things that you need to have in place. Otherwise, there is no point in starting it.
Yeah, and having said that, we're going to post a graphic of the pizza. I'm still trying to figure out where the pepperoni and the mushrooms are on it. We're going to post a picture of that.
Very
framework.
good. You're making
obviously
me
in the
now.
show notes there. Yeah,
yeah, that's absolutely fine, and we'll talk around it as well. No worries.
So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this idea. So this is about the BPM Adoption Framework, and my question before we get even started is the question of why. So why is a framework necessary as a concept in order to guide your operations? Why do you need to consider this prior to even starting the conversation around BPM, or at least BPM adoption? Or why would it be a problem if you didn't have a framework like this in place?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, JM. So my experience with BPM is that it can virtually and in reality touch every nook and cranny of an organization. It really goes down to the smallest little places in an organization if you do it right. Meaning that a lot of things starting to get together and they start being connected if you do BPM properly. I mean, it's not a methodology to make you work differently. It's a methodology to manage your processes properly, or maybe in a different way. So at the moment that you say, why do you need a framework? Well, the good thing with frameworks is that they simplify things for people to understand them better. It's to simplify the concept, and it's to get the attention of the people in an organization that is let's say pursuing BPM, to get the attention on the things that matter most, because you can focus your attention on many different things, and maybe you have the same experience as I have, but if you take 10 BPM implementations, I reckon that 8 of them start with tool selection instead of thinking about why are we doing BPM in the first place, which is to me question number 1. If you can articulate why you need to do BPM to your executive sponsor, to somebody on a C level, you won half the battle.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have the same experience. I would even go higher. I would say 9.5 out of 10.
Sure.
Would be and give me the new bling, and how is your tool different than Visio, and all those wonderful questions, because people think, well, I buy a tool and it does all the work for me. hint, hint,
Yeah.
AI, ha, ha, ha. And it just doesn't work that way. So I wholeheartedly agree with you, Caspar, on asking the why question.
Yeah. And at the moment that you start working with a framework, it also becomes easier to start to link things that you observe in an organization to points in your framework. So at the moment that you say, okay, so I see that you've done you've defined your ownership of a process. Did you also define the ownership for the end-to-end process, or did you define ownership for a functional domain? And if not, then you immediately basically have a little place in the framework to say, well, this is where you're lacking at this point. This is where you need to do some extra work. So it gives you a bit of a visual roadmap also, or a spider chart to say, listen, well, this is where you do pretty well, and this is where you really need to have some attention.
So we spoke now a lot about the fact that there is a framework that you develop, but maybe we dive a little bit in, because this is an audio podcast, and I'm not sure how many people have seen it. Maybe you can explain what the elements are that it's comprised of.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So imagine a circle that you slice up in 4 parts, so 4 quadrants. Each one of these quadrants is a main category in the framework, and there's 4 of them. And the first one, I would say, is called sponsorship. It's about how well are you capable of creating an allegiance with the decision makers at the top to make sure that your project is funded, protected, so you can mandate it. So we'll get back to more details later on, but that's number 1, sponsorship. Number 2 is governance. And governance is also, again, a bit of an umbrella term. And think about things like ownership of processes, but also what kind of procedures do we have in place in case of, for instance, one of your global owners leaving the company? How do you deal with that succession? Or how do you deal with management of change? There's my earlier topic back on the map. I love to talk about that one. Anyway, the third one, the third main category is, I call that center of excellence. And this is the one about the tooling and the modeling methodology and the conventions and the filter sets and the reports, all the technical stuff that those project teams love to dig in, because they don't have to work with humans. That's my underlying assumption there. But anyway, and then the fourth one, and that's the one that we added as the most recent addition. We originally had 3, but we added the fourth one called human affairs. And human affairs is exactly what the term implies. It's about organization. It's about communication, because communication is something that is really underrated, I would say, in most BPM projects, if not all projects, but certainly in BPM projects. So you have 4 main categories. And then just to complete the visualization of the framework, each of these 4 categories is subdivided into 2 subcategories, just to keep it as simple as possible. And for each of these 8 subcategories, we basically answer 3 questions. We answer the why, the what, and the how. Or if you want, the why, the how, and the what. I mean, I always have a bit of a different difficulty with the last 2. It starts with the why. I mean, we can all agree with Simon Sinek, it does start with the why. And then you can start to think about, okay, what kind of questions can I ask my client and my customer to understand where are you on this? I would say, I don't like to use the word scale, but where are you on this so far?
So this is essentially, I see this as you mentioned the pizza of each of these pieces of the puzzle. So you're using this as a conversational prompt for solutioning. Is this correct? So you're trying to answer all these questions as part of your ability to deliver BPM to an organization.
Yeah, so I typically used it in 2 ways. So either I used it as displaying results of a solution review, and saying, listen, we've done a series of interviews. This is where I think your maturity is on each of these aspects. Or if I'm simply in a conversation with a client, and they sometimes ask me to take a look at the way that they're doing their project real quick, I bring out the framework and I first take them through. And even just talking them through the framework, you can sometimes literally see them connecting the dots in their head. And that is something, if that happens, I'm already happy. I mean, at the moment that people start to think about, oh, wait a minute, but this is linked to that, and we haven't thought about that yet. So we need to fill in that gap, and then I can use the framework to basically just help them draft a sort of a roadmap to see, okay, what do we need to do? Where do we need to focus on? So those are two main use cases, I would say.
Yeah. So before we go into obviously the details of the framework, which I think is obviously the second segment of this show, let's talk a little bit more around the stuff that you just mentioned. Where do you use that framework? I heard obviously solution reviews, all that type of stuff, but I'm pretty sure there's other application scenarios that you could see how the framework will be used.
Yeah. So I think the most prominent use case is to help organizations realize that there is much more to look at than just a tool and a couple of process models. I think that was the original idea why we started developing the framework anyway, is to make sure that whenever BPM projects don't run optimally, and they hardly ever, unfortunately, run optimally in the first go round, this is something for them to hold on to. This is a little bit of that that helm that they can use. The last piece of, I don't know how they call it in English, but you just give them that life buoy to say, listen, you're treading water right now on your BPM project. Hold on to this, and you'll get to shore safely, and you can start to think about what else do I need to do to make my project a success. And I think that was use case. That was the main use case for this. And also, it was also, I think, an internal thing in saying, okay, so do we actually know what drives adoption of BPM within organizations? And in all honesty, by no means I'm assuming or pretending that this is a scientifically researched framework. It's an experience framework that we've developed over the course of about a year and a half, 2 years. But the people that work with me on this, if I add it up, I think we get to 20 or 30 years of BPM experience. So somewhere I would be as arrogant to say we have a kind of an idea what we're talking about. We know a little bit.
I get that. Interesting to me on this that you don't have a question about when. So I'm assuming that the entirety of your BPM adoption framework, the when is sort of handled on when you choose to introduce this. And I wanted to ask about that in particular. First and foremost, when is the first conversation about this? And secondly, when do you refresh on this? Like how often is this brought up as like not a North Star, but like as a continuous, like, here is something we look to as a reference for everything we're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's logically speaking or naturally speaking two moments that you use this for the first time. So either the customer or the client hasn't started yet and they want to get started. So you're greenfield basically, and you basically tell them, listen, this is where we need to think about. We don't have to solve everything, but this is what you need to think about if you want to scale your BPM project successfully. And you want to make sure that it's being adopted within the organization. What happens more often, I would say, is the situation where they're already running a project for a number of years, or maybe even in business as usual for maybe 8 or 10 years, and they still have the feeling that they are not getting the most out of it. And that is something that I hear quite often. And then you bring in the framework, and then it's very usually connected with a solution review or with a maturity assessment to say, okay, so this is what you need to do to be successful. Where do you think you are on all of these 8 pizza slices? And then we can start to work on that. And just before so we'll probably deal with this a little bit later on, but each of these 8 segments that you have in the framework also has some good practices connected to it. So we know by now what would be good to do in each of these situations.
Well, with that in mind, Caspar, we've talked a lot about the idea of why we use this, and what we're going to take a bit of a break right now to give people a chance to think a little bit about where they've struggled before with BPM adoption, and a framework they wish they maybe had not like a once again a reference for how they should approach this challenge. We talked about the sponsorship, governance, the COE, and the human affairs of this at a high level. So we're going to give you a brief break to think about what kind of adoption challenges have you faced? What blockers did you find? Where have you found that this has been a challenge, a struggle that we talked about a little bit before? How did you address this? When did you address this? And what sort of outcomes did you face as a result of your approach? We're going to come back in a moment, and we're going to take a look at the details of each of these slices of the pie as we continue our conversation with Caspar Jans.
The wind will blow, but it's just changing. It's just changing. The wind will blow, but it's just changing.
And welcome back. Caspar, very interesting concept that you have. And in the break, we obviously enhanced it, which we will talk about in the second part as well. So JM and I take a little bit of credit for it. It's not much, but a little bit for it.
That's fine. We're very, very, very agile with this. So
let's start with sponsorship. Let's go one at a time. Caspar, you talked about sponsorship. There are two sub-segments of sponsorship, and we'll lead through one at a time to go through these each and explore them a little bit, and then we'll talk about how they connect to each other. So start us off with sponsorship.
All right, very good. I'll try to keep it a little bit sweet and short, because otherwise we'll be having a very long episode. But the first one is your executive sponsor. That one person that you need to make sure that your project gets funded, mandated, protected, explained, aligned, all of these things. And ideally, I would say your executive sponsor is C-level, C-1, maybe C-2 if you really want to stretch it. But if you go lower than that, you're going to be running into hierarchical issues when you're trying to spread the oil stain of BPM in your organization. So this is a very, very important person. Ideally, also, one of the side tasks of an executive sponsor is to be the chairman or chairwoman of your process governance board, or whatever you want to give that authority body a name. Doesn't really matter what kind of label you give it. But you really need that person to be your friend. And you need to keep them involved and engaged. Simple example, if you're running an organization with multiple business units or business groups, and you want to move into a new business group with your BPM project, you might run into the situation that president or director of that business group is not waiting for your BPM project. Sometimes the unintended or maybe even unexpected consequence of BPM is that you have levels of transparency that you didn't have before. And sometimes these business groups, they see their own business as their little kingdom in their little own ivory tower. And you as a project team typically can't open the door by yourself. You need that executive sponsor to break down that wall, or just to open the gate and say, you're going to do this project at that business group. And if there's any issues, you let me know. That's why you have that person. So that's an executive sponsor. Does that make sense to you?
It does, but it also means we're purely talking about organizational power, right? It must be Mr. Bigwig who has the mandate to do this, right? Yeah. It's not a bottom-up approach, because that will stop at some point in time. Because as you said, that business unit lead might just say, man, not interested, go away.
Yeah. Exactly.
How do you enshrine, and this is a question, I mean, this is obviously about sponsorship, but how do you enshrine this into something in the organization in the case that your sponsor leaves or has another priority or gets, seconded into something else? Yeah.
Or how do you find one? I had multiple calls with clients who are just asking, well, where should we put this thing? Is it the CFO? Is it the COO, or lower, or who is it? How do you find those guys?
Two different questions. Let me answer the second one first, and then I'll come back to you, JM. So where to put this? Ideally, I would say either CFO, COO, or COO. not the CIO, anywhere but the CIO. Not because I don't like CIOs, but they typically have a little bit of a narrow vision on what BPM is, and we've seen in the past that BPM was part of the CIO function in many cases. It didn't work. I saw the same thing in my previous company called DSM, where I worked for almost 20 years. We had a chief finance officer who was our executive sponsor. And he understood this because he did the same thing in his previous company. So he came from, I think, BASF or Bayer. He came to DSM and he said, where's the processes? He was just used to working that way. So that's a luxury position. So you have a very strong executive sponsor. But when he left and he was succeeded by a new CFO, who was a very incredibly intelligent lady, but she didn't have that BPM background. And then they brought in a new CIO, and they moved the whole BPM practice into the CIO function. And within a year and a half, it was gone. I mean, that is what can happen as well. So that's question number 2. Question number 1, how do you enshrine it if he leaves? Well, you need to have a very clear conversation on the BPM responsibility that your executive sponsor had, and that you need to find that in a new person as well. Because if you just look for, let's say if your executive sponsor is a CFO and he leaves or she leaves, and you're just looking for the next CFO, and you focus on the finance stuff without thinking about the BPM activities and responsibilities that your CFO had as an executive sponsor, you might run the risk that you get a new CFO on board that doesn't support that BPM project the way it needs to be supported, and then you're in deep trouble. You need to find a sponsor each time one leaves.
Yeah, you have no power.
Yeah, and they don't stay forever. So
yeah, of course.
This will happen.
C-levels love to jump around, which I think is part of the reason I see in so many companies that I've worked with that they eventually end up rudderless and sponsorless. They feel like they've lost their power because there's so much movement in executives. And that's something that unless you have some sort of rules of operation in the organization, like our way of doing things, like I feel like there's a couple of organizations that I've worked with who say like, this is the company name way. Unless you have a mantra, you're going to lose that ability to deliver when you lose the person who first said those words. That's scary. That's one of the reasons why I very often advise clients to think about, if you want to do a BPM project, take a look at your strategic initiatives as a company. And you can find them on the first 10 pages of any annual report. And try to figure out which one of these strategic initiatives are being supported best by BPM, and piggyback on that one. Because those strategic initiatives will be there at least for another 3 to 5 years, despite the fact if people change and leave or not leave. So you make it a bit less connected to a person. You need that executive support anyway. But as it's easier to say, listen, we have an operational excellence target in our strategic initiatives list. We know that BPM supports that to a tremendous level. That means that the next time a new sponsor needs to be found, you can point to these strategic initiatives and say, listen, this is what you need to do.
I wholeheartedly agree. You need to make the case for your existence. Hey, we contributed in that value to the organization's success. You definitely need to make this clear, right? Ideally, you can put it in dollars or cents. But even though, right, we passed sometimes our ISO certification, whatever it is. But I think there's also another next level of people in the sponsorship who are not that organizational top dog role, if you will, but who are similarly important, right? Because they might have the endurance, they might stay there for a long time.
So you basically described the second segment in sponsorship, Roland, which is the stakeholders. And with stakeholders, I mean BPM stakeholders, obviously. And think about basically every role in the organization that is connected to processes. It could be subject matter experts. It could be process owners. It could be business group presidents, because it's ultimately their business processes that are being executed. So this is a much larger group than just the executive sponsor. They do require different ways of engagement and involvement. And so one of the activities that I often do when it comes to this particular segment is to just run a stakeholder analysis exercise. And you just I'm not sure if you ever done one, but I'm sure you did.
Mm-hmm.
You draw it across two axes where you say, listen, what is the attitude of my stakeholder towards my project, and what is the influence that person has? And you just map them. And then you try to figure out which ones do we need to move, which ones do we need to cherish. And that really, and it's not that you, the main benefit for this is that your client starts to think much more in terms of stakeholder management, because ultimately the BPM technology part is relatively simple. It's about making sure that there's enough significant key people and key positions that know why you're doing this and that they understand that. And that makes your rollout of your adoption of your BPM concept much easier.
Yeah, but there's a couple of things. And yes, we spoke about this in the podcast before. There's a whole methodology called NetMap. I don't know if you heard about that, but that's basically also a different way of mapping your stakeholders. Mm-hmm. But up to a point where and this is the question, if you should show that to your client, where you basically then also find the stakeholders that don't play ball, the ones that you want to isolate and you don't want intentionally not to be super involved or give them a platform of disturbing your efforts. It's very important to figure that out. But there's not all stakeholders are equal.
True.
Right? So back in a previous life, we came back with 11 archetypes of roles that are involved in that game. Can you elaborate a little bit more when you use the word stakeholders in your pizza slice here? Who you mean? Because yes, the end users might be one thing, but they might not be the crucial factor.
No. I think the two crucial roles for me are always the process owners that you have, and as a derivative, maybe a process champion or lead or process manager, but that whole stack of people that own or manage a process, and the subject matter experts. So they sometimes called business process experts as well. So SMEs or BPEs, to me, the same thing. Those two are, I think, the most important stakeholder groups that you have. For obvious reasons, because the one in the process owner vertical, they come back in the next subsegment anyway. And the subject matter experts, because they probably are the most intense users of your BPM platform, and they form a sort of a translation function between the BPM methodology on one hand and your end users on the other hand.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody on this, and obviously you will see the updated graphic that we will post. Remember, there's always the why, the how, and the what, right? So it's also a progression that you have to define and then map where you are on this. But moving on, and Caspar, you alluded to it, obviously, when we spoke about the stakeholders, what is the next pizza slice? It's a big slice.
So the next slice is in the governance quadrant. So now we move into governance. And that also means that you now try to formalize the mandate. I think one of these great additions that we talked about in the break that I thank you for already is that on those intersections between the quadrants, there is you can put a term to that. You can put a word on it to say, listen, what describes that? So if you move from sponsorship to governance, the word mandate comes to mind, because in sponsorship you define the mandate, but you formalize it through your governance. And the next segment to me would be ownership, Roland. So where you basically say, how are we defining the ownership of our processes and end-to-end processes and domains across the organization? In other words, who owns what? And this sounds straightforward, but trust me, it's not. Yeah. This can be this can be stuff for wars, internal organizational wars, if you're not careful.
You say it sounds straightforward, Caspar, but I think a lot of the practitioners on this line, when you said the word ownership, I heard a lot of people slightly cringe, because that has been the source of conflict in so many situations. We talked about this in a previous podcast, but I love this idea that everybody wants to own everything and nobody wants to be responsible for those
Oh
things.
yeah.
And
I know.
they want to take the pride of being the person who gets to control and manage and take the credit for it. But when things start to fail, suddenly, oh no, I didn't bring my wallet. Oh, can you pay?
Yeah. They want to have the baby, but not the labor. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, no, don't go that. Do not go that path. Yeah, but I think two words come into mind, and I wholeheartedly agree with this. People want to have the role, the title, or whatever, but the two words that come into mind is responsibility. Because now, if you're the process owner, you're not the process owner for your org unit or your little group or whatnot. You're the process owner for the goddamn organization, or even further on. Think about supply chain, vendors, and whatnot. The whole value chain. So responsibility is the one thing, and then the other topic is on a more personal level, because they're also a stakeholder. Is like, what's in it for them? What is the outcome? What is the missing the word? How do you incentivize them?
Yeah, and those are good questions. And I think that, let me start with the first one. So from there is another word that goes together with responsibility, which I think is very crucial when you talk about ownership. It's accountability. Because ultimately, to me, the process owner is accountable and will remain accountable. And still, they can decide to delegate the responsibility to somebody slightly lower down in the organization. It's what you see happening quite a lot, actually, because global process owners are very often executives in the company. I'll just take an example from my DSM days. The chief procurement officer was the global process owner for everything around procurement and sourcing. So purchasing, sourcing, all of that. But he already understood that he was too far away from the day-to-day practice and operations in order to be capable of taking decisions that have an impact on that shop floor level. So what he did is, while he remained accountable, he actually delegated to his responsibilities to two champions. We call them process champions. One for sourcing, one for purchase to pay. And that means that the one that did the purchase to pay part, who happened to be my manager in those days as well, before I started doing the BPM Center of Excellence stuff, that director of the shared service center was responsible for the whole process of procure to pay across business groups across the globe. Meaning that if he wants to do his work correctly, he needed to have that type of control. It was not enough just to be in control of your own processes, but he needed to be in control of the entire end-to-end process for purchase to pay. Yeah. And this is where this ownership topic very quickly can get very ugly. And this is where the size and the all the things that JM mentioned earlier come from, is that you get a tug of war in many cases. It's like, okay, it's a pissing contest. So this is, well, it's mine. No, it's mine. It's come on.
Yeah, it's the mandate, right? That's why we came up with that. Yes, and in your example, maybe your C-level guy was more the process sponsor.
He was the process owner. No, he was the process owner.
Yeah, but in our reality, yes, owned, but he didn't do anything, right? So he was more.
He only took the difficult decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyways, so there's a blurry line. I think that's what I want to say.
It is a blurry line. Yeah. And then another thing, and that's the second segment in this quadrant around governance, is I labeled that procedures, and that sounds maybe more formal than I mean with it, but to me procedures is about first and foremost, how do you keep everything up to date? So this is where my precious management of change resides. I insisted to have a place for it whenever I made a framework, that's need to be in there. The second thing is that what happens, and we talked about this, I think, with this executive sponsor, what do you do if one of your owners leaves? You need to find a new one. What kind of procedure do you have in place for that?
Yeah.
So a whole collection of, you can also call this segment, this is the process of business process management.
Dan, I just wanted to say, a friend of mine calls it always the process of process,
Well, there you go. Yeah.
The rules of engagement. Yes.
It's exactly that. If I go to a customer that wants to do BPM, and they show me a process map that has all of the functional domains in there, the first question is, where's the BPM domain? Yeah. And they ask me, what do you mean? He said, yeah, well, you're going to do BPM, so you need to have a process of process management, because you need to make the rules of engagement when it comes to modeling and maintaining and working with changes and all of that.
If you don't have that, you're going to be stuck out of luck if you have a situation of ownership change, which we talked about before, or you have a situation where you need to define a clear set of guidelines for things like ISO certification or regulatory compliance. Like, this feels like a pretty easy in to things that have already been defined, which leads me to a question about it already having been defined. Like, I feel like procedures, there are best practices from which you can draw, but your biggest challenge here is deciding which ones you're going to follow and which ones you're going to bake yourselves because it matters to your specific company circumstance.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to mention here is that there is no silver bullet and there is no one size fits all. There is a whole bunch of good practices around and that we know that work, which sometimes frustrates the hell out of me, because every customer I get in contact with, they always ask me, can you justify why we need to do this? Well, it has been done like a zillion times before and it works. I mean, how much more proof do you want? But still, you need to prove it time and time again.
I think what helped in my projects was I carved out a work package where I literally had people modeling out that process, where you had a big fat value chain, how do we create content? How do we publish? How do we operate those interfaces? Yada, 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 right? Yeah. And that was actually a good foundation, because that were all the conversations about who's doing what, And then once we agreed on that, well, guess what? We could talk about permissions. We could talk about how do we structure the organization, right? We could talk about what do we need to teach people, right? So everything that you have in human affairs derived out of that big value chain that then had one more level of BPMNs underneath to say, okay, this is how we run the show.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. Absolutely.
And then with this in mind, Caspar, I mean, I want to take us through the next segment here, because after governance, you mentioned a word which I think we've also had a conversation about on this podcast before, which is center of excellence.
Oh, yes. It's a very nice umbrella term that can mean many things. In this case, I chose that word because it always covers things like tooling and methodologies. So if we talk about, again, that transition from governance to center of excellence is about operationalizing the things that you put on paper, right? Because a procedure is something that you put on paper. This is how it should go and how it should be done.
Right.
But if you really want to put the rubber to the road, this is where you get your COE stuff done. And again, a center of excellence does not mean that you're going to have a large group of people sitting somewhere on corporate level. There are many different ways and forms of running a center of excellence and shaping that into your organization. But the most important so there's two segments in this one, and I'll start with the tooling one, if you allow me, because I think that's the easiest. At a certain point in time, you need to make a decision: which BPM platform am I going to use? And of course,
whiteboards.
Yeah, fine. Miro, fine. There's the other one, Mural. Even PowerPoint if you want to scare me away, but that's fine. And if you really want to just scare the hell out of me, you do PowerPoints stored on a SharePoint drive. So now I probably alienated about 80% of your listeners, but anyway, you need to find, if you want to do proper BPM, you need to find a proper tool. This is not the podcast to talk about which tools that should be, but you need to have a tool. You need to have a platform that allows you to easily model, to easily disclose that information so it can be consumed, to cover all of your procedures and your ownership. So basically everything that's in this framework needs to find its place in that platform. You want to have it as covered as possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's as much as I want to share about that.
And it should be... it should be collaborative and the single source of truth, right?
And there should be Gen AI support and you name it.
This is why your PowerPoints on SharePoint don't work that well.
No. Yeah. So what you try to do, and that's what I always say to my clients as well. So listen, what you're looking for when you start to do modeling is you're looking for a minimum viable set of content that covers your organization.
Right.
Because as soon as you go above that, you introduce redundancy. And sometimes you have to, in case of variance of processes, and you need to introduce a little bit of redundancy, but you don't want, and that's what happens with PowerPoint, you don't want to blindly copy functions because they happen in multiple processes. Because every time that you need to make a change to one of those functions, you'll be making that change X number of times, while in fact the BPM platform simply allows you to change it once and does the rest for you. I mean, that is already a very, very huge benefit. You stay in control with a BPM platform, whereas with SharePoint and PowerPoint, it's impossible to stay in control.
Yeah.
And the BPM platform is sort of moderated by some of the things you've already talked about, right? The tooling has a methodology. That methodology is aligned with your organization's need, which is your stakeholders.
Yep.
And it is aligned and controlled through the ownership structure you've established in governance.
Exactly.
And it operationalizes the procedures that you put in place to managing. This is, I see how this is all starting to connect in to one big picture of
very good, Jan.
making it work.
Yeah. maybe Caspar, a clarification, because we might have listeners who are not BPM nerds, right? So the occasional person, well, maybe somebody stumbles upon this because they saw your picture and they thought, ooh, who's that handsome man that I want to listen to and spend an hour of my time with? Just for clarification purposes, because that slice that JM is alluding to, you labeled it method, right?
Yeah.
And obviously everybody says, oh, there's a method to the madness. Yada yada yada.
Yeah,
can you define the differences between those two pizza slices that are close together, procedures and method?
Yeah. So methods is all about what kind of agreements and decisions do I take on how to document things in my BPM tool, because you can document processes in many different ways. You need to make some agreements on that and some decisions. And I can give you a very simple example. One that still frustrates the heck out of me is where we were working with a very large financial institution that needed to make a choice on modeling notation. Now, I don't want to open the can of worms about EPC versus BPMN.
We already had this BPMN 1. JM is crying.
I know. But even though that institution knew that they were migrating content from other BPM tools that came in the form of BPMN, and they knew that they were going to do process mining, which is very often BPMN driven. Somehow they still ended up with EPC, against my better judgment. But anyway, I'm not omnipotent. I mean, they just made a decision, and I think they will regret it in the future. But I mean, that's the kind of decision you need to take in the method segment. Why do we make a choice? For what? And it's not just about a process model, but it can be about how do we document our operating model? How do we document our regulatory requirements? How do we document our application landscapes? What kind of filtering do we apply? What kind of reporting do we have in place? So in other words, how do we operationalize all the things that we need to do to manage BPM?
Yeah, I think it's the two words that come in my mind is structures, setting up whatever, not only in your database, but how do we see the world? What are the different angles that we look at? And then obviously you said notations, which I would translate into languages. How do we say I love you in English, German, and French? Yeah. And I think we all agree it sounds the best in French.
Ah oui. Bien sûr.
Well, I can see how this COE is also, there's a few different other roles that happen in the COE that support this. And I think this is when we talk about moving from a COE to helping support your teams, that these roles are going to be enacting their particular capabilities on. We start to talk about the word enablement. And I wanted to use this as a bridge into the fourth slice of the pie here, which is our human affairs you talked about. I love those. I love that word. Those are words, human affairs, which I think sort of covers such a wide variety of things you could serve people with.
Yes, it does. It does. And it has two sub-segments in there, at least the ones that I chose in this case, is organization and communication. And I'll start with the organization part. So at the moment that you decide to go on a BPM journey, you need to think about, how am I going to organize not just my project, but also my business as usual phase afterwards. And the business as usual phase very often has that center of excellence in it, in either shape or form, and in whatever location in the organization. But that also means that, what kind of change management do I need to do? In other words, what kind of behavioral changes do I need to accomplish within the end users of my organization, so that they are susceptible and viable to receive the BPM gift, so to speak. So what kind of things do I need to put in place? Because just sending them a link or an email and saying, listen, we are now doing BPM and this is your system and you can do this and this and this, with all due respect, but that's not going to work.
No, you earn their buy-in. And if you've done your stakeholder analysis, you get an understanding of what their needs are. So now you need to address their needs and communicate it with them in a fashion that brings them to the table willingly, rather than necessarily forcing. A thing that you said earlier, very early, is about sponsorship and mandate. As it covered, I hate mandates. Or at least I hate to use mandates. I like that we have a mandate.
Yeah, it's a big stick that you
come
have
willingly.
Yes. But this is the thing between, this is something that you need to do versus this is something that you want to do.
Right.
And if you can convince people that they want to do something, you don't need the stick. But at the moment that they don't want to do it, you do have a big stick that can still change their mind that they need to do it. I mean, if you ever coached a youngsters sports team, you know that there's a fine balance between having that stick and using it. And just the illusion of the fact that you have it sometimes is enough to get people in line and start following your lead.
So let's talk about the communication side then, because I think that the way we don't have to use a stick is if we're able to effectively communicate the value to each of our stakeholders along the way, and as I used the word before, we're effectively able to enable those stakeholders to use the BPM components we put in place, the practices, the tooling, the visibility and data, all these sorts of things that are relevant for their particular needs. And that's a carrot I'd rather offer. So how do we communicate that?
Well, the funny thing is here that this segment is not put there because of the things that you just mentioned, JM. They are absolutely true. But this segment is here to make people understand that they need to communicate in the first place. It's not even about the what and the how. This is about the why. And because what we see happening quite a lot is that an organization makes a decision to engage in BPM. They do the organizational part. So they form a project team, they get to work, and they lock themselves up in a conference room or in a project part of the building. And then 3, 4, 5, 6 months later, they come out and say, we've done it, we've documented the organization. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the organization goes like, who are you again? And you have been doing what? Because you haven't kept them engaged. The communication part is, I mean, the initial communication is typically always there. We're going to do this new project. And certainly if you have executive sponsorship buy-in from C-level, there will be communication. That's fine. But you need to have that drumbeat in saying of, well, this is what we've set out to do in the next period. Might be a month, might be a quarter, depending on the phase that you're in. And then at that next period, you say, okay, so what did we say that we're going to achieve? Did we achieve it? Yes or no? So we celebrate that little win. And this is what we're looking for the next period. And by doing that, you keep not only your stakeholders, but maybe even the more general public, if you want, you keep them engaged and involved. So that at the point that you do say okay, now I'm ready to move from a project phase into a business as usual phase, you don't have to start doing that change management all over again. You just already took them by the hand. You maybe kept them at arm's length because they didn't need to know yet all of the details, but they do need to know what's going on and why you're doing this. I mean, that why it comes back so many times, but it's crucial.
Yeah, I see that organizations just simply forget, because they're in that project mind, and say, okay, hey, we're done, and now move on to other stuff. But in the long term, it obviously harms your effort that you have, because you're just seen as, why do we have to do this again? We just had that big reorganization 2 years ago, and that was promising all those big improvements, was it a failure? That type of stuff.
That's true.
Yep.
And if you communicate it too much as being a project, and at the moment that you say the project is done, then a part of the organization might expect that they also stop doing BPM at that point in time.
Yeah.
Because the project is done.
You build a capability, right? You build
the project is just a ramp-up phase.
Yeah.
Nothing more, nothing less.
Yep.
So those are the 8 segments that I find very useful in my conversations with customers.
Except, Caspar, you forgot the intersection between human affairs and sponsorship.
Hey.
To close it out.
Oh, very sorry. Yeah, absolutely true. And what that does, it provides transparency.
Yeah.
It provides the executive sponsor and the stakeholders with, I think, much more insight into the how and the what of running this project. So if you look at take a look at the picture in the show notes, dear listeners, and you see that there is the inner circle is a why, and then there's 2 circles above that are the how and the what. And you typically, I would say, you start with the why in the sponsorship, you add the why from human affairs and governance, then you do the why for COE, and then you start thinking about the how and the what for everything.
I love it, Caspar. I can see sponsorship, governance, COE, human affairs, such an important part of getting people on board and making BPM a reality for organizations. I feel like it feels a long way away for people who are trying this for the first time, because they encounter resistance. They haven't provided the value for the organization or the value statements yet for the organization. They don't necessarily have the sponsorship, which means they can't really mandate or anything. They can't necessarily find ownership, which means information is maintained by different people with conflict in that. They can't support their people because they don't have the tooling or the expertise in-house, and they don't know how to talk about this and make this a ritual rather than making this a one-time affair. And I hopefully everyone in the audience, you're listening and maybe you've experienced this before. Think about some times where you've really struggled with adoption. You've been struggled with sustainment of a BPM practice, and you didn't have the sponsorship or the governance, the COE, or a clear plan on human affairs to make this come to life. What challenges did you experience? And given you've heard these segments, how would you address the why, the how, and the what of each of these pieces of the BPM adoption framework to help make yourself more successful in the future with your next BPM implementation? We'll leave you for a moment to think about these things. We'll come back with our last thoughts and conclusions for the episode.
Love won't let you down, won't let you down. Yeah, hey, I need, hey, yeah, I need your love won't let you down. Hey, happy, yeah, I need your love won't let you down, won't let you down.
And welcome back to the last segment of this show. We're approaching, or maybe we are already over the self-imposed 1 hour mark. So
sorry about that.
No, it's all good. It's all good, Caspar. I enjoyed our conversation. I enjoyed it so much that I'm happy to invite you for a third thing, and then you get the official ambassador title. So it's all good.
Thank you. I'm more than happily accept that invitation.
I have 2 questions. One is obviously the usual one. Where can people reach out to you? How can they find you?
Yeah, so the easiest way is via LinkedIn. So just go to my LinkedIn profile, send out an invitation to connect, or send me a message. I'm there daily, I would say, or more than daily. And you can also find the occasional blogs I put out there with some more detailed information around the things that we talked about today.
Yeah, and I definitely will put links into the show notes, right?
Yeah.
But I want to be a little bit of a spoiler here because I know a little bit more. I heard a little birdie told me that we will hear more about you or from you. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for this opportunity to shamelessly plug in something else. So I recognize that I've been writing a lot about BPM, and I want to make it easier for people. So together with one of my esteemed friends in BPM, Russell Gummersol, I'm starting up my own podcast as well.
Ooh.
And it's going to be called BPM 360.
Ooh,
with a subtitle
all right.
covering every angle. So it's gonna be two bald, bearded guys with 40 plus years of experience in BPM, just giving you their own opinion about BPM.
Hey,
And
that
we
sounds
will
great.
make sure that we all listen in. You know, you will
very
get all
good.
the big critiques on LinkedIn, like, oh, Caspar.
Yeah. So one of the ideas that we're having is, and there's this one podcast that I love to listen to. It's called The Rest is Politics. It's a British political podcast, and they have this thing called Question Time. So we are setting up a special email address that after a couple of episodes, people can start asking us questions about BPM, and we'll dedicate episodes to just run through the questions and try to answer them. So we're trying to make it a bit more interactive that way. And then maybe in a later stage, we might even think about guests.
Ooh.
So keep your calendars clear, guys.
It sounds like a really fun podcast, and we're excited to see new people enter into the space of BPM podcasting. And we
Thank you
welcome
very
it.
much.
My goodness, the more we can spread the word and spread best practices about the things we love very dearly, the better for everyone.
Absolutely.
And talking about spreading the word, friends, thank you so much for being part of our wonderful audience today. Thank you so much to Caspar for showing up and giving us a clinic on BPM adoption. Now, if anyone wants to go see the graphic or find out more information about how this whole episode comes together, including all the show notes and everything you might need to see, please go to whatsyourbaseline.com for this episode / 66. And of course, whatsyourbaseline.com for lots more articles and thought leadership. If you like this, please leave us a like and share this with a couple of your BPM practitioner friends in the industry. We love to see our audience growing. As always, we will take questions and comments, and feel free to reach out to us throughout all of the many major channels we use, including things like LinkedIn or email. But until our next foray together, I've been J.M. Erlinson.
I'm Caspar.
And my name is Roland Wold.
And we will see you in the next one.